Okay, so here we are, and we're about to start another week reading more of Paul's letters. I don't know how you're finding it, but one thing that's always helpful with the letters is to understand the background behind each of the letters that Paul is writing. So this week we're about to read Colossians, we're going to read 1 and 2 Thessalonians, and we're going to read 1 and 2 Timothy. So just in a nutshell, here's the background behind each of those letters. The letter to the Colossians, Paul's never been to Colossae, but a friend of his planted the church there and has told Paul all about it. So he's writing to them. They're relatively new believers. And one of the things that Paul is addressing is elements of false teaching that he's picked up, they've begun to believe, and he's trying to correct that. So he talks about the worship of angels, he talks about regulations to do with food and drink. But what I love is the main way that he tries to correct their false teaching is actually just by talking about Jesus. So he points them to Christ all the time, and he's lifting Christ up, and he mainly talks about the supremacy of Christ. And it just reminded me of, I remember hearing about how they train people in the FBI to spot a fake dollar note. Like the way that they do it is not by getting them to look at loads of fake banknotes, but actually getting them to really study the original dollar. And when they're so familiar with what an original dollar looks like, they can then spot a fake. And it's kind of like Paul's doing that in this letter. He's, rather than just addressing lie by lie, the false teaching that some of them have picked up, he's just saying, this is what Jesus is like. He's Lord of everything. God made everything through him, in him, everything holds together. He's the invisible, kind of the image of the invisible God. He's just glorying in who Christ is. Then when he's writing to the Thessalonians, you can read, and we did read, back in Acts chapter 17 about how he started the church in Thessalonica. And it was quite an adventure. He plants this church, and then not very long after that, there's a riot. The guy who's hosting him is arrested and charged with treason. Paul ends up having to be sneaked out in the darkness so that no one can take him to the authorities. And so he leaves behind this vulnerable young church in its infancy that he clearly hasn't had the time to invest in like he would have wanted. And what he did as a result of that is after some time he sent Timothy back, because Timothy wouldn't have been in the same danger that Paul would have been had he returned. He sent Timothy back to find out how the Thessalonian church is doing. Then when Timothy gets back to Paul, Paul writes at that point the first letter to the Thessalonians. And so a lot of the letter is about his anxiety for them, but also his relief that he's heard they're actually doing really well. Even though they're being persecuted, they're still trusting in Jesus. And he also addresses a number of issues that clearly have been raised with Timothy about sexual immorality, about the second coming of Jesus, about some people that weren't doing any work, but were just expecting everybody else to provide for them. So he addresses some issues like that. And then the second letter to the Thessalonians, he wrote almost certainly not long after the first letter. And it's because he's heard that there are some people going around in Thessalonica saying in his name that the second coming of Jesus has already happened. And so Paul's quite upset, first of all, that they're saying this thing which is not true. And secondly, that they're saying it in his name. So he's correcting that quite fiercely. And he's also, and you'll notice as you read it, having a go at these people that are still lazing around and expecting everybody to provide for them, even though he told them in the first letter that they should stop doing that. And then finally, 1 and 2 Timothy. These are letters that Paul wrote to Timothy. And the context of these ones is that Paul left Timothy in a very difficult situation in Ephesus. So the background was the church that Paul started in Ephesus had some elders. Some of those elders, it seems like, began to teach some stuff that was wrong, false teaching about all sorts of different things to do with the Old Testament and do with how we relate to creation and some other stuff. And also they began to act in an immoral way. Particularly it seems that they were manipulating the young widows in the churches. And Paul excommunicated two of these elders. One of them refused to leave. And so Timothy is left trying to work out, how do I lead this church? How do I pastor this situation? So as we read it, we can almost put ourselves in Timothy's shoes. And so that's why certainly 1 Timothy is concentrating not so much on the gospel, but on the nature of false teaching, and also how we should look after widows well and what that might look like. And then 2 Timothy, Paul has been arrested, he's in Rome, and he's urging Timothy to come and join him and to come quickly because winter is coming. But also Paul has already had his preliminary court hearing, and certainly from the vibe of 2 Timothy, it doesn't look like Paul's expecting to be released. It's more like he's expecting to be executed. And so this letter, although it's uplifting, it does read kind of like Paul's last will and testimony. And chronologically, it's the latest letter that he wrote in the New Testament. That's a lot of information, but hopefully as we read through, some of it will make sense and we'll be able to enjoy again hearing the Lord Jesus speak to us through his word.